This program is brought to you by McGill University. Please visit us at www.mcgill.ca.
So this is Carl Moore talking management for the Globe and Mail. Today I'm talking to Henry Mintzberg, a McGill professor in management. Good afternoon, Henry.
Good afternoon, Carl.
The covers of Economist, Fortune, and Business this week I happened to look at, we're all talking about renewing capitalism. What's your take on that, Henry?
I think they just don't get it. I think the core of the problem is much deeper than that. Capitalism is not the solution, the answer. It's one way of raising capital and encouraging private investment. But to refer to the whole economy as capitalism is nuts. I think we need to recognize that there are different sectors in society that have different purposes. There's certainly a role for a capitalist type of fundraising and so on, although, as I said, I'm not very keen on doing it through publicly traded markets, at least as they're conceived now. But there are other ways. We need an economy, even the business side of the economy, that's not necessarily capitalistic, at least as we use that term. We need, if I mentioned co-ops as an example. I mean, there's lots of other ways of doing things. I mentioned my publisher recently, a few minutes ago. When they wanted to raise some money, instead of going to public markets, they went to all their authors and said, would you like to buy shares in our company? And the authors love the place so much. I don't know whether all of us bought, but I'll bet almost all the authors bought shares. I certainly bought shares. The place. So this is very patient capital. The owners, so-called, who bought those shares just want to make sure that Barrett Kohler keeps doing what it's doing. So we don't bother them. I speak to the president these days often because I've got a book coming out. I don't ask him how he's managing my company. I've got great faith in him.
Mm-hmm. What's the role of civil society or NGOs in government? Do you see that role changing in the next while?
I hope so. I think that a solid society, like a stool, sits on three legs, and I think one leg is the private sector. No question that's got a lot of attention. One leg is the public sector, which has been terribly depreciated in the United States for years. You show me a society that's working well now, and I'll show you a robust, strong civil service, like Sweden or Canada or France. And so you need a strong, solid, respected public sector. Americans replace all their civil servants down to quite a number of levels every time you change presidents. So you get a clown running FEMA. It's nuts. If it's so good, why don't they do it with the military? Why don't they change all the generals every time there's a new president? They say, well, we have to have a professional military. Well, why don't you need a professional commerce department or a professional education department? It's the same kind of argument. And the third leg, is what I call the social sector. NGOs, call them NGOs, or not-for-profits, or co-ops, or what have you. It's a huge part of society, completely forgotten. We don't think about a society comprising three sectors, but it does, and the third sector has to be recognized and built up so that we attain some balance. That's why capitalism belongs in the private sector. It doesn't belong in the social sector. It doesn't belong in the public sector, obviously.
So what's the role of the social sector, that third leg of the stool?
Well, at its limit, business is crass. And at its limit, government is crude. And for lots of things, we don't want to choose between crude and crass. For our health care, we don't want to choose between crude and crass. And it turns out the vast majority of American hospitals are neither public sector nor private sector. There are for-profit hospitals and there are public veteran hospitals, but most of the hospitals, so-called voluntary or whatever you want to call it, are non-owned. They're in the social sector. Education, Harvard, Yale, Chicago, McGill, they're all in the social sector. They're not owned by government. They're not privately owned. If capitalism was so good for everybody else, why wasn't it good enough for Milton Friedman and all his colleagues at the University of Chicago? There are universities that are publicly traded. Why didn't those guys leave the University of Chicago, which is social sector, and make a beeline to these private sector universities? Are they not telling us something? Are they not telling themselves something? These organizations can be more engaging. They tend to be less crass. They tend to be less crude. They can be much more nuanced. I think news is almost exclusively in the private sector, with Fox News at the extreme, though far, far extreme. And I don't think that's healthy for a democratic society. I think we could use much more in the way of news coming from the social sector that's beholden neither to private corporations nor to public government.
Well, I guess NPR and the television, public television, is kind of more like that.
You know what? CBC in Canada, even though it's state-owned, is more like that than NPR, because now they're running their ads, which is, used to be just, with the support of, now you've got a whole little blurb, so they're essentially running ads. But the control of NPR, or at least, I don't know about NPR, but
PBS.
PBS, in terms of I think the ability of the president to influence the choice of leadership there is quite strong. Might even be stronger than in the CBC, which has an independent board of directors.
So we're seeing, do you think 10 years from now, will the world be a fair bit different than it is today?
Yeah, absolutely. If for no other reason than the American economic system is collapsing.
So this is a
And
serious times.
by that I mean that the corporations are in dire straits, and I don't think people recognize it. And I don't think America will be competitive. And by the way, the whole idea that America is so productive, America's not productive at all. In a certain respect, if you want to be really productive in your company, fire everybody and ship from stock. Until you run out of stock, you're really productive. And that's what American corporations have been doing. They've been cutting and cutting and cutting, so they look productive the way economists measure productivity, but they're not productive at all. They're destroying their companies in many cases. There's obviously a big element of productivity that is truly productive. There's another big element that's this phony kind of short-termism.
But it seems like if we're in for difficult economic times, the natural reaction of companies is to cut people to reduce costs. But what you're calling for is kind of the opposite of staying the course. Is that possible?
Well, it depends. We can't generalize. It depends where a company is. If a company has its back to the wall and is going bankrupt, I can appreciate they have to cut costs any way they can. But if a company is not going bankrupt and is simply not feeding out dividends or profits the way it did, then it has to think twice about the impact of laying people off, because you're basically outsourcing your culture. You're destroying your culture to some extent. So companies have to think carefully about those kinds of relationships.
If I asked you about what's your advice for President Obama or McCain when they go in February, what advice would you do in terms of managing the American economy? What should they do?
I think, and I think Obama's there, I think the most important thing is a massive change in attitude. A massive change in attitude about how we look upon leadership, about the idea of communityship, and certainly the Obama campaign is about communityship. And even Obama's leadership is not this egocentric, heroic leadership. People impute that to him, but I don't think he's acting that way. I think he's actually quite modest in how he's doing things. I may be the only person who thinks that, but I do think that. So I think it's a change in attitudes towards how we view our institutions. And if Obama does get the nod, then I think that sets an example. But there's got to be a stop to a lot of things. Frankly, I think number two, besides attitude, is there's got to be a groundswell. People can sit and bitch all they like about executive compensation and all that. That's not going to get anywhere until people start taking things into their own hands. I don't mean rioting or anything like that. I mean simply putting their foot down and saying, we will not tolerate certain behavior, and the way we will not tolerate it is we will not buy from your company, or we will not support certain things that are going on. I think if there's a groundswell that says enough is enough, and action has to be taken by people on the ground, you can see huge changes.